The morning it happened, Mara was wearing a second-hand coat the color of old rain clouds, holding a casserole dish she had made entirely from scratch beginning at 5 in the morning, standing in the marble foyer of a house so large it had its own name engraved above the front door in letters of fresh gold that caught the pale winter light and threw it back with the smug certainty of something that has never had to justify its own existence. She had taken 2 buses to get there. The first had been nearly empty at that hour, cold and humming with the particular quiet of a city not yet fully awake, and she had sat near the front with the casserole dish on her lap, wrapped in 2 layers of foil she had pressed down carefully at every corner, watching through the fogged window as the city changed around her, as the streets widened and the hedges grew taller and better maintained and the houses began to pull back from the road as if the road itself were something they had chosen not to associate with. The second bus had been faster and more crowded, and she had stood the whole journey with the dish braced against her hip, and she had arrived at the estate's entrance gate 20 minutes early, which she had accounted for because she had looked up the journey the night before, and again that morning, and she did not leave things like arrival time to chance. She had ironed the coat the night before until it lay flat and held its shape with a kind of borrowed authority, and she had polished her shoes until they reflected, not perfectly but honestly, and she had taken care with her hair and with the small details that a person takes care with when they understand that they are entering a room that will be looking for reasons to diminish them and have decided not to provide any. She had done everything she knew how to do, which was considerable, because Mara had been raised by a woman who believed that showing up for a thing fully and with care was a form of self-respect that no external circumstance could compromise, and she had carried that belief through nursing school and through a decade of hard shifts and through every room that had ever looked at her and seen less than was there. And none of it mattered. None of it mattered at all, because before she had even crossed the threshold fully into the main hall, before the casserole dish had touched any surface, before she had been offered a drink or a greeting or even the most basic acknowledgement of arrival, Vivian Ashworth looked her up and down with the slow, deliberate, surgical precision of a person who has been making these assessments their entire life and has never once been required to defend one, and let her gaze move from the coat to the shoes to the dish wrapped in foil to the face above it. And then she tilted her chin at the specific angle of a woman for whom certainty is not a conclusion, but a permanent condition, and said in a voice pitched precisely to carry the full length of the foyer and to bounce off every marble surface and crystal fixture and heavy-framed ancestor portrait that lined the walls, as if the architecture itself had been designed with this specific moment of cruelty in mind. My son said he was bringing a woman. I didn't realize he meant a charity case. The laughter that moved through the assembled guests was soft and practiced and perfectly calibrated, the laughter of people who have been performing this kind of social execution their entire lives and have long since stopped registering it as anything other than the natural order of things. Mara stood in the doorway with the dish in her hands and the cold air at her back and the warm amber light of an obscenely beautiful house before her, and she felt something move through her body that was not quite fury and not quite grief, but something older and more precise than either, the feeling of a person who has been seen incorrectly and knows it with total clarity, and also knows with equal clarity that correcting the people doing the seeing in this particular moment would be both beneath her and premature. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not let the casserole dish fall. She did not let her expression change in any way that would give the room the satisfaction of having landed. What she did, in the quiet center of that very public moment, was make a decision. A small, very private, absolutely final decision that would take exactly 2 weeks to fully execute, and from which there would be no reversal and no appeal. But that comes later. What comes next? What Vivian Ashworth, and every single one of her silk-dressed, pearl-accessorized, entirely certain guests were approximately to discover, is something that rearranges the very architecture of a person's understanding of the world, and you are going to want to stay for every single second of it. 3 years before the marble foyer and the casserole dish, and the cruelty that would eventually undo everyone who participated in it, Mara Solène had a life that fit her, like a book she had read so many times the spine had softened, unremarkable from the outside, and full of something irreplaceable within. She was 31 years old and worked as a restorative care nurse at a mid-sized hospital in a city that was not famous for anything in particular, which suited her because she was not a person who required her surroundings to provide her with significance. The hospital was understaffed in the chronic and grinding way of institutions that rely on the dedication of their people to compensate for systemic underfunding, and the work was hard in the specific way that matters, not the kind of hard that gets celebrated in speeches or noticed in performance reviews, but the kind that leaves a mark on your body and on the part of yourself that you carry home at the end of a shift, and that does not fully clock out when you do. She sat with patients who were afraid of things that deserved to be feared. She held the hands of people in their final hours, when their families could not be there, or were there but had reached the limit of what they could bear to witness, which amounted to the same thing from the perspective of the person in the bed. She remembered the names and the preferences and the small personal details that patients mentioned once, in passing, assuming no one was paying that kind of attention, and she paid that kind of attention because she believed it was the difference between care and the performance of care, and she was constitutionally unable to perform what she could actually provide. She stayed late without being asked, and arrived early without announcing it, and on her days off she sometimes drove to the hospital anyway to check on patients who had been on her mind. She went home every evening to a small apartment on a street lined with plane trees that shed their bark in long, pale, curling strips every autumn, and she found this deeply beautiful in a way she had never been able to fully articulate, the way something could lose its outer layer entirely and still stand, still be rooted, still be entirely itself, only newer on the surface. Her apartment was not large, and it was not decorated with any particular ambition, but it was full of things she had chosen deliberately. Books stacked in a way that made sense only to her, a sofa she had owned since nursing school that was objectively too big for the space, and which she had never once considered replacing, herbs on the kitchen windowsill that she talked to with the unself-conscious ease of someone who has never cared what this looks like to other people. She had 3 close friends who knew her the way people only know each other when they have been present for real things, not the curated version of real things that gets shared in groups, but the actual texture of a life in process, the difficult Tuesday evenings and the small embarrassing victories and the conversations that go on too long because neither person wants to be the one to end them. She had a devotion to terrible reality television that she watched without guilt or apology or any defensive irony, sprawled on the too big sofa in socks she had owned for too many years, sometimes pausing to comment aloud to no one in particular. And she had a mother, or had had a mother, who had taught her through the accumulated texture of a life lived with genuine integrity, rather than the performance of it, that the only things truly worth carrying forward were your word, your honesty, and the unshakable private knowledge of your own worth in the moments when no external validation was available, and no one who could offer you anything was watching. Her mother had died 4 years prior and left her nothing in the legal sense of inheritance and everything in the real sense of it. There was a box, small, wooden, with a latch that stuck in damp weather and released with a particular pressure that Mara's fingers had learned the way fingers learn anything they do repeatedly and with feeling. Inside, photographs and 1 ring. The photographs were of people and places she knew some of and had been told about others, and at the very bottom, beneath the pictures of Mara as a child, and beneath the pictures of a coastline she had never visited, but which had always seemed, in some quality she could not name, to have something to do with her specifically, were photographs of a kind she had never asked her mother to explain, and her mother had never offered to. The ring was old in a way that antique dealers would have found interesting, and that Mara found simply correct. Thin-banded, made of a metal worked over so many generations that its original composition had been absorbed into something new, set with a stone of such an unusual color that it resisted description. Not quite green, not quite gold. Something between and beyond both, shifting with the quality of the light in the way that deep water shifts, in the way that things of real age and depth appear to move even when they are still. Mara wore it on her right hand every single day without exception, had worn it every day since her mother's hands had placed it on her own, and when people asked about it, as people always did because it was the kind of object that asked to be looked at and asked about, she smiled and said it had belonged to her family for a long time. She did not say how long. She had learned, in the patient way, that children learn the things their parents teach them not through instruction but through example and through trust, that some things do not need to be explained. They only need to be kept. She met Etienne Ashworth on a Tuesday in November, which was perfectly fitting because Tuesdays in November are the least romantic days available to the calendar, grey and purposeless in the specific way of days, that exist only as transitions between something that happened and something that has not happened yet. And what occurred between Mara and Etienne began with the most ordinary and unglamorous and earnest circumstances imaginable. She was leaving the hospital at the end of a double shift that had run long for reasons that were both important and exhausting. And by the time she walked through the sliding doors and into the cold, dark wet of that Tuesday evening, she was tired in the particular way that comes from having given the best of yourself to other people across 14 consecutive hours, with nothing held in reserve for the performance of being a person in public. The rain had been falling for 6 hours with the persistent, humorless commitment of November rain in this city, and her umbrella had been destroyed at the end of the afternoon by a gust of wind that had come around the corner of the hospital building with what felt like personal grievance, turning the umbrella inside out in a single violent motion that also managed to snap one of its support arms. And she had stood for a moment looking at the wreckage of it and decided that this was simply the kind of day it was. She was standing under the narrow overhang of a pharmacy that had closed an hour earlier, her coat already damp at the shoulders, waiting for a cab that the app kept showing as available, and then as taken in the 2-second window between her request and the confirmation, doing this on a loop with the serene persistence of someone who has decided that frustration is not a useful response to a situation she cannot control, when she became aware that she was not alone under the overhang. He was standing 3 feet to her left, doing the same thing, waiting for the same recalcitrant cab, holding the ruins of his own umbrella, which had suffered an equally catastrophic structural failure, and which he was holding by the handle with one finger, in a way that conveyed that he understood the umbrella was finished as a functional object, but was not yet ready to abandon it entirely. He looked at her, and his expression was one she would spend considerable time thinking about later, discussing with Priya, and then eventually with herself in the private way that you turn something over in your mind when you want to understand it properly, because it was an expression entirely free of self-consciousness or agenda, or any attempt to be seen as anything other than exactly what he was, which was a man who was wet and tired and waiting in the rain, and had noticed that another person was also wet and tired and waiting in the rain, and found this situation genuinely, openly, helplessly funny. He said, "I think the city is trying to tell us something." She said, without really thinking about it, "I think it's telling us we should have left earlier." And then they both laughed in the way that people laugh when they are sufficiently exhausted and wet that the social protocols around laughing with strangers have temporarily suspended themselves, the laughter of shared recognition rather than performance. He introduced himself. She introduced herself. He discovered that the night manager had left the pharmacy's interior door unlocked, which made the vending machine inside technically accessible, and he bought 2 terrible coffees in small paper cups and brought one to her with the gravity of a person presenting something of real value, and they stood under the overhang drinking the bad coffee while the rain demonstrated its commitment to continuing indefinitely. And when a cab finally appeared after 43 minutes, she had agreed to have dinner with him the following Thursday. He was warm in the specific way of people who have made a considered decision about how to be in the world rather than defaulting to whatever came naturally, warm in a way that was a choice rather than a habit, and this was recognizable to her because she was the same kind of person. He listened to her the way people who have genuinely learned to listen actually listen, which is to say he heard the thing beneath the thing she was saying, the layer of meaning underneath the words, the context that she hadn't explicitly provided, but that was present in how she said what she said, and this was so uncommon in her experience that she noticed it with a specific kind of alertness, the alertness of recognizing something rare. He told her he worked in international consulting, that it required a great deal of travel, that he had spent more nights in hotel rooms in the last 5 years than in any apartment he could call his own, and that he was honestly and without drama rather tired of it. He did not expand on this. She did not ask him to. They were, in this foundational way, very well suited. Over the dinners that followed, over the months that followed, she learned the shape of him, the particular contours of his humor and his silences and his way of being present in a room, and she found that each thing she learned confirmed rather than complicated the impression of that first evening, which was the impression of a person who was simply, substantively, genuinely good, and who was carrying something he had not yet found the right moment to put down. She did not ask what that something was. She understood that trust built in one direction invites trust in the other, and she was content to wait for the moment when what he was carrying would be ready to be shared, because she had always been, at her fundamental core, the kind of person who understood the difference between a secret and a thing not yet ready to be spoken. He proposed 8 months later, on a Sunday evening that began as all their Sunday evenings had begun since they became the kind of people who had Sunday evenings together, which was with no announcement and no agenda, with the quiet ease of a routine built from the accumulation of many small good choices. He arrived at her apartment with a bag of groceries and the intention of making pasta, which he was genuinely accomplished at in the way you are accomplished at things you have made many times for people you love, and have had the results received with real appreciation rather than polite tolerance. He brought a bottle of wine that she would later discover cost considerably more than her monthly electricity bill, but she did not know this at the time, and would not have felt any differently about the evening if she had, because she was not a person who assigned the worth of a gesture based on its price, but on its sincerity, and the sincerity of this particular evening was beyond question. They cooked together in her small kitchen, sharing the one good knife, and working around each other in the easy choreography of people who have learned each other's habits of movement and no longer require announcement or negotiation to share a space well, and the kitchen filled with the particular warmth of a meal being made with care and the sound of conversation that did not need to go anywhere, because the company itself was the destination. They ate at the table by the window that looked out over the plane trees on the street below, bare now in the late autumn, their white and olive bark pale and structural in the streetlight, beautiful in the way that things stripped to their essential form are beautiful, and after dinner, in the particular quality of quiet that settles over a good evening when it is winding down and no one wants to be the first to name the ending, he took her hand across the table. He turned it palm up, very gently, the way you handle something you have decided to trust yourself with. He placed something in it. He said very simply, without any architecture of speech constructed around it, without any setup or preamble, "I would like to be the person you come home to." The ring was extraordinary in the way of things that are exactly what they are, and have never been uncertain about it, set in platinum worked as fine as solidified winter light, bearing at its center a stone of the color that she knew more intimately than she knew almost anything else in the world, that shifting green gold that was not quite either thing but entirely itself, the color of her mother's ring, the color of the stone she wore on her right hand every day of her life, matched with a precision that should not have been possible across time and distance and the hands of separate makers, and that stopped the breath in her throat as cleanly as a hand laid gently against her chest. She looked at the ring for a long moment. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has said the truest and most consequential thing he knows how to say, and is now simply and quietly waiting for the world to respond to it, not performing patience, but actually practicing it, which are very different things. She said yes before she had finished looking, before she had assembled all the implications into anything like a complete thought, and he released a breath that was the most honest thing she had ever seen him do, the breath of a person who has been wanting something for long enough that the actual receiving of it requires a moment of physical adjustment. They sat at the table for a long time afterward. His family, he told her then, watching her face with the careful attention of someone who is gauging how much to say and in what order, was complicated. She told him that all families were complicated if you got close enough. That complexity was simply what happened when human beings occupied the same spaces across long periods of time. He said she might find his specifically and significantly more complicated than she was currently picturing. She looked at him across the table with the ring on her finger and the ring on her right hand and the match between those two stones that she had not yet asked about and that he had not yet explained. And she told him she had managed 14-hour shifts with 2 understaffed wards, a consultant who expressed himself exclusively through implication and deniable hostility, a broken elevator that the facilities team had been promising to fix for 4 months, and a Tuesday in November that had destroyed her umbrella and then produced the best thing that had ever happened to her, so she was confident she could handle complicated. He smiled. It was the smile, she would understand much later, of a man who loved her completely, and was also, in some layer of himself, he was not yet ready to name aloud, genuinely afraid for her, and was holding those two things simultaneously with the practiced strength of someone who has been holding complicated things quietly for a very long time. The luncheon entered their lives through Caris, which in retrospect should have been the first and sufficient warning. But Mara was not a person who assumed malice where incompetence or obliviousness might account for the same observable facts, and Caris had been Etienne's closest friend from university, and had occupied that position in his life with the possessive ease of someone who has decided that proximity to a remarkable person is itself a form of distinction worth protecting. Caris was a particular kind of person, the kind that is not immediately recognizable as dangerous because their hostility is always packaged in the language of helpfulness, their undermining always delivered as concern, their cruelty always framed as candor, and it takes a certain amount of exposure and a certain quality of attention to understand that the warmth they project is constructed rather than felt, and that every piece of information they share is selected and timed for effect rather than offered freely. She called Mara on a Wednesday evening and explained the luncheon with the thoroughness of someone sharing urgent and important intelligence that you would be foolish not to act on. Vivian Ashworth hosted a formal family gathering at the estate every year without exception and had done for 30 years. Every person of any significance in Etienne's life attended. The absence of a fiancé would be noted and interpreted in ways that could not be easily undone, and Mara should understand that this was her opportunity to establish herself correctly before any other impression had a chance to form and calcify in the minds of people whose good opinion it would be useful to have. Caris delivered all of this in the voice of someone performing a genuine act of friendship, her tone perfectly calibrated to make refusal seem like ingratitude, and acceptance seem like the obvious and rational choice. Mara accepted. She accepted because she was not a person who retreated from difficult or unfamiliar situations, and because she had made a commitment to build a life with a man, and that man's family was a real component of that life that she intended to engage with directly and without avoidance, because avoidance was not a strategy she respected in herself or in others. She told Etienne that evening, and he went still in the particular way he had of going still when something required more layers of processing than the surface of the situation suggested. And then he said, with a certainty that had the quality of a decision rather than a hope, "I'll be there with you." And she received it as the promise it was. 2 days before the luncheon, at 6:17 in the morning, a message arrived on her phone from Etienne's assistant. A situation had developed in Geneva that could not be managed remotely. Etienne needed to be on a flight within 12 hours. He was deeply sorry. His driver would collect Mara and bring her to the estate. He would be back by evening without fail. He would call her the moment the aircraft landed. Caris was sitting at Mara's kitchen table when this message came through. She had arrived that morning with pastries and the easy manner of someone who makes a habit of being present at moments of consequence, and she had been watching Mara's face from the moment the phone had buzzed. She watched her read the message, and then she set down her coffee cup with the deliberateness of a person who has been waiting for a specific moment and is relieved it has arrived. And she said, gently, that it would be terrible to cancel at this stage, that these things happened with Etienne's work, that Vivienne would absolutely understand about the Geneva emergency, that Mara should go and show them who she was on her own terms, that honestly it might actually be better this way, less pressure, more of a chance to make her own impression without Etienne hovering. She offered to drive her. She said it was absolutely no trouble. Mara, who was not a person who treated obligations like options, and who had decided that the luncheon was an obligation she had accepted and would honor, thanked Caris for the offer of the ride, declined it without explanation, and went. She took the 2 buses. She carried the casserole dish she had already prepared. She arrived on time, because she was always on time. She was wearing the ironed coat and the polished shoes. She had done everything right. She had done everything that could be done, and none of it would be sufficient against what was waiting for her in that marble foyer, and none of it would need to be, because the thing that was going to be sufficient was not the coat, or the shoes, or the food, or the timing, but the ring on her right hand, and the stone in it, and what that stone, and she herself, had always been. The estate announced itself incrementally, which was its own deliberate form of performance, the kind of performance that requires no active effort because it has been staging itself for centuries and has long since mastered the art of impression. The road surface changed first, smoothing from the ordinary to the immaculate several hundred meters before the gates, as if even the approach to the property had been brought under the estate's governance. Then the trees changed, the planting becoming intentional and formal, 2 rows of old growth lining the drive in the kind of symmetrical authority that takes generations to achieve, and that communicates, without a single word, that the people who live here have been making long-term decisions about beauty and permanence for longer than most institutions have existed. Then the gates themselves, wrought iron and immaculate and very tall, standing open as if they condescended to be necessary rather than truly requiring them, the family name worked into the ironwork at the center of each gate in a script that had been decided long ago and had not been reconsidered since because it had not needed to be. And then, at the end of the long, pale gravel drive, flanked by those old and formal trees, the house. It was the kind of structure that does not trouble itself to make an argument for its own grandeur, because it simply is grandeur, built in pale stone that had aged into a color that was neither warm nor cold, but entirely its own, with windows of a height that spoke of rooms designed to impress on arrival and retain on inspection, and a roofline of such proportional authority that it looked not built but arrived at, as if the house had always existed in some essential and inevitable form, and the centuries of construction had merely been the world catching up to something that had always been there, waiting to be made physical. Inside, the foyer was the house's thesis statement: Italian marble in pale cream, veined precisely with gold, polished to the kind of finish that reflects not just light, but the quality of things, so that you saw yourself in the floor, and the self you saw was slightly better dressed than you remembered. A chandelier of a scale that should have been excessive, and in this room was simply accurate. The light it caught from the tall front windows dispersed through its facets across the ceiling in patterns of such complexity and beauty that they appeared to have been engineered rather than incidentally produced. The smell of the place reached her before anything visual did, and it was the smell she had been warned about in no practical terms, the smell of money of sufficient age and density to have become something architectural, not the smell of products applied or of particular materials, but of the air itself having been made of different stuff than ordinary air, as if even the oxygen here had been processed through centuries of accumulated exclusivity and had emerged refined. Vivian Ashworth stood at the center of it in dove grey and pearls, and the posture of a woman who has never once in her adult life had her right to occupy any space she chose, questioned by anyone whose opinion she was required to consider. She looked at Mara with the focused and complete disdain of a person for whom contempt is not a reaction that occurs when something specifically warrants it, but a practice maintained continuously and applied selectively, a discipline exercised the way serious people exercise anything they have decided is important to their identity. She took in the coat, the shoes, the casserole dish in its foil, and she constructed her assessment with the speed of someone who has been making these assessments their whole life and has never once been asked to show her working. Behind her, the guests stood in the quiet, expensive clothing of people who have never had to choose between looking right and being comfortable, and they watched with the mild and practiced attention of a group that has already received, through some medium other than words, the verdict of the room's most powerful person, and is now simply watching to see how the verdict will be delivered. Caris moved one step to the left. Mara noted it. She set the casserole dish on the entrance table and freed her hands and looked at Vivian Ashworth directly and said, "Good afternoon. Thank you for having me," in a voice that was clear and without a single quality of apology in it. And she went into the luncheon, and she sat, and she ate, and she spoke when she was spoken to, and she kept, throughout all of it, the ring warm in her palm, and a decision private in her mind, and the knowledge, which she had always carried and would always carry, of exactly who she was. She excused herself at 2:30, found the downstairs bathroom at the end of the corridor past the portrait gallery, a room tiled entirely in hand-painted antique ceramic, in blues and whites and creams that told some story across its walls in images she did not have time to read, and she sat on the edge of the pristine bathtub and looked at the ring on her right hand for a moment before she called him. The stone caught the light in the way it always did, the way she had watched it catch light her entire adult life, shifting between its colors with the slow patience of something that has all the time in the world and knows it. She called Etienne. The call connected on the second ring. She had noticed before that he was always quick to answer her calls, but the second ring today had a quality she could distinguish from his usual quick answer, the quality of a phone that has been held in a hand rather than set in a pocket, of a man who has been waiting for this particular call and has positioned himself to receive it immediately. She told him what had happened. She used the voice she had developed over years of delivering information that was difficult for people to receive, clear and precise, and entirely stripped of the decoration that people sometimes add to difficult information in the hope that the decoration will soften it, because she had learned that decoration does not soften difficult information, it only obscures it and forces the recipient to do additional work to find the truth inside it, and she respected him too much for that. She told him exactly what Vivian had said. In what words, at what moment, in front of how many people, and who they were. She told him what Caris had done in the moment after the words had been spoken. She presented it as a set of facts because that was what it was, and because she understood that facts presented accurately and without embellishment were sufficient to convey everything that needed to be conveyed. The silence on the other end of the line, when she finished, was the kind of silence that has substance and specific gravity. It was not the silence of a person receiving unexpected news. It was the silence of a person receiving the confirmation of something they had feared knowing for certain, a fear that is in some ways worse than ignorance, because it requires you to now act on what you know, and Etienne had always known, somewhere beneath the hope that it would not be necessary, that this moment might come. When his voice returned, it was different from any version of it she had heard before in 8 months of learning all the versions. The warmth was still present, but it was behind something else now, something dense and quiet that did not announce itself, but occupied its space in the conversation with an authority that needed no amplification. He said, "Are you still at the estate?" No question mark. She said yes. He said, "Go back to the main room now. Find a chair that you are comfortable in. Sit in it. Do not leave and do not engage with my mother or with Caris or with anyone on this subject. I need you to trust me completely on these specific instructions right now." She started to tell him that she was perfectly capable of managing this on her own terms, that she was not frightened or undone by what had happened, that the drive home had been arranged, and she could simply leave with her dignity intact without any further involvement from anyone, and he said her name. He said it in a way she had not heard him say it before, quietly and with a gentleness that sat on top of something as immovable as stone, and then he said, very simply, "None of that is your concern right now. Please go and sit down." She went back to the main room. She chose a chair near the tall window that looked over the estate's winter garden, the structure of it exposed and deliberate beneath the stripped trees, beautiful in the way of things that do not require ornamentation to be what they are. She placed her right hand in her lap, the stone warm against her fingers. Her heart was doing something she observed with the trained detachment of a person accustomed to monitoring physiological responses from the inside. She had the sensation, precise and unmistakable, of standing inside the stillness that precedes a storm. When the pressure in the air changes character and every bird and every branch and every living thing receives the signal simultaneously and goes quiet, because something is about to happen that will reorganize everything. The sound came 23 minutes later. It arrived through the tall front windows from the direction of the gravel drive, and it was the sound of multiple vehicles moving with the kind of unhurried, coordinated authority that belongs to convoys that have nothing to prove, and therefore prove everything simply by the precision of their movement. The room became aware of it in the involuntary way that rooms become aware of significant things, not through announcement but through the collective adjustment of posture and attention that occurs when a group of people receives the same signal at the same moment. Vivian stopped speaking mid-sentence, a sentence about the east wing's guttering that she had been in the process of completing for some time, and the cessation of her voice had the effect of making the sound from outside suddenly the most prominent thing in the room. The head of the estate's security staff appeared in the drawing-room doorway with an expression that Mara had never seen on the face of any professional in any service or security role she had encountered, which was the expression of a person whose professional training and whose established protocols have just been rendered, simultaneously and completely, insufficient to the scale of what is currently presenting itself outside the property. He was a man who had spent 20 years managing the complexity of a large private estate with the kind of calm that comes from having seen nearly everything and having procedures for all of it, and he did not have a procedure for this. He crossed the room to Vivian with the controlled urgency of someone who understands that how he moves in the next 30 seconds will communicate more than he wants it to communicate to everyone watching, and he leaned down and spoke to her very quietly. Whatever he said, the effect was visible in the way that Vivian's certainty left her face. It left in the way that something essential leaves a room when a door is opened, not with drama, but with irreversibility. And what remained on her face afterward was an expression she had not worn in this room in 40 years, which was the expression of a person who does not know, for the first time in recent memory, what position they occupy in the present moment. She stood. She walked to the tall front window that overlooked the drive, and she stood with her back to the room, and the room watched her back and understood from the quality of her stillness, from the particular way her shoulders were held, that what she was looking at outside that window was not something she had anticipated and not something she had a prepared response for. Outside, on the pale gravel of the estate's drive in the pale, cold light of the November afternoon, 4 vehicles had arranged themselves in the formation used by security convoys of consequence, a formation that communicates through its geometry alone, without any additional signal, that the person it surrounds is of a kind that the world makes arrangements for. Dark and long and without variation across their immaculate surfaces, they bore at the front corners of each vehicle small flags on short masts that Mara, who had moved to the window because her body moved before her mind had caught up to the instruction, recognized in the instant of seeing them with a recognition that traveled through her from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet, like cold water finding its level in a container, steady and certain and complete. She had seen those flags before, in the photographs at the bottom of a wooden box with a latch that stuck in damp weather. In images her mother had kept without explanation beneath images of a coastline and images of a child. The standard of the House of Solène, a house that had made a complete and deliberate withdrawal from public institutional life 4 decades ago, but had never, in 4 centuries of continuous existence, dissolved, had never ceased to be what it was, had only changed the form of its expression in the world. The vehicle doors opened. Men in dark suits took up their positions with the synchronized precision of people whose entire professional existence is organized around the single purpose of ensuring that one specific person meets no friction and no harm from the world. And they were very good at their work. And then Etienne stepped out of the 3rd car, not the 1st, and he was wearing a suit she had never seen on him, constructed for his body with the precision of something that was made rather than bought. And he was wearing an expression she had never seen on him either, the expression of a man for whom the current situation presents no complexity and no ambiguity, a man who has already determined what needs to happen and has already set it in motion and has arrived to complete what he has begun. He walked through the front doors of the estate without knocking, which was its own entire statement, a statement that the room received and understood without requiring interpretation. He walked through the foyer, which had gone completely and voluntarily quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when something enters them that is larger than the understanding of the room, the guests having pressed themselves toward the walls with the unconscious instinct of people in the sudden presence of something that has reorganized the hierarchy of the room simply by entering it. He walked to where Mara was standing, and he took both her hands in his, and he looked at her, just at her, for one moment, with the expression she knew, the warm and careful and present expression of the man who had stood in the rain and bought her terrible coffee and said he wanted to be the person she came home to. And in that moment everything that was about to happen was also a private thing between 2 people. Then he turned to face the room, and the expression shifted, and what remained was something that did not require volume or heat to communicate its weight. He said, "My name is Etienne Solène Ashworth. The Solène portion of that name has never been decorative, and I will not be treating it as decorative from this moment." He looked across the room at his mother. Vivian Ashworth, who had not been the smallest person in any room she had occupied in the last 4 decades, was the smallest person in this room. She was small in the way that something is small when the thing it has been measuring itself against is suddenly revealed to be of an entirely different scale than assumed. He said, "My fiancée arrived at this house this morning in good faith and with genuine effort. She made food with her own hands and carried it across the city on public transport to bring to this family as a gesture of respect and goodwill. She was insulted in your entrance hall in front of your guests within 60 seconds of her arrival before she had been offered anything. The person who brought her here and was standing beside her when the insult was delivered moved away from her at the moment of impact rather than standing with her." He paused. The pause was not for effect. It was for the people in the room to fully receive what had been said before more was added. Then he turned to Caris. Caris had gone the particular pale of someone whose body has understood something before their mind has caught up to it. He said, "You arranged for her to come here knowing I would not be present. You watched what happened. You moved away. You will not attend our wedding. You will not receive the introductions or the contracts you were anticipating through my offices. Please leave now." Caris opened her mouth. Something moved behind her eyes that was not quite a plan and not quite an appeal. She closed her mouth. She left. The sound of the door was the loudest thing the room had produced all afternoon. Then he turned to Vivienne, and his voice went somewhere below its previous register into a place that was less a volume than a quality, something that occupied the room the way temperature occupies a room, without needing to announce itself or compete with anything. He said, "You have spent 40 years in this family believing that the Ashworth name and the Ashworth estate were the only measures of consequence that applied in any room you occupied. You believed you were assessing someone of no account when you spoke in this foyer today. The woman you called a charity case holds a lineage predating this house by 3 centuries. The foundation she is to chair endows more in a single quarter than this estate generates across a full decade. This morning she was on a bus. She was on a bus because she does not require her circumstances to announce her. She was carrying food she made herself because she understood this family to deserve a gesture made with real effort, and she honored that understanding even knowing the risk. That is not poverty. That is a form of character that money does not create, and that has been conspicuously absent from this room today." A glass at the far edge of the dining table fell from where it had been sitting since the luncheon. It hit the marble and shattered. No one moved toward it. He picked up Mara's coat from the chair where she had placed it and held it for her, and she put it on, because it was hers, and she had ironed it, and she would continue to wear it for as long as she chose. And she took his arm, and they walked through the foyer together past the generations of ancestors in their heavy frames. Past all of that inherited certainty that had just been measured against something it had not known was in the room, and out through the front door and into the cold, pale afternoon, and the door closed behind them. 3 items required resolution in the week that followed, and Etienne moved through them with the same economy and the same quiet and the same expression of a man for whom the required action is simply the required action. The first was Vivienne's position on the board of a charitable institution she had chaired for 11 years, a position she occupied with the specific sense of entitlement that comes from having never been asked to justify it, a position that had given her both social currency and a degree of influence over philanthropic funding that she had exercised with the partiality of someone who had confused personal preference with appropriate stewardship. A letter arrived at the board offices describing in precise and documented detail certain patterns in the financial management of the institution that had developed under her tenure and would not survive independent scrutiny, and suggesting clearly and without drama that a voluntary step-down would be considerably preferable to the form of departure that the alternative represented. Vivienne resigned within 48 hours, announcing to her circle that she was withdrawing for health reasons she preferred not to discuss. No one in her circle who retained any capacity for accurate perception believed this. The second item was a piece that appeared in a society column 6 days after the luncheon, the sourcing of which required no investigation to identify, describing Mara as a woman of uncertain origin and evident ambition, who had positioned herself strategically in the life of a well-connected man, substantially above her social station, the prose of it carefully calibrated to suggest without asserting, to injure without providing grounds for specific challenge. The response to this piece came through no form of counter-narrative or public engagement, because public engagement gives a story oxygen, and Etienne did not intend to give this story any. Instead, a quiet meeting occurred between the publication's largest advertising partner and a member of Etienne's legal team, after which the piece was retracted with a correction published in the same column in which it had appeared, a correction of a comprehensiveness and visibility that was itself a statement, that made clear the nature and the extent of the original error, and that no one in the relevant readership could fail to interpret correctly. The editor sent a personal letter of apology that was not acknowledged. The third item was Caris, who discovered in the weeks following her departure from the estate that the professional introductions she had been anticipating, the contracts she had been depending on, the doors that had been appearing to open, had closed with a completeness that was not explicable by any single cause she could identify and challenge, and that was therefore impossible to address directly. She called Mara twice. The calls were not answered, not because Mara was incapable of answering them, but because there was nothing to say that would be productive for either party, and Mara was a person who did not engage in performances of reconciliation that she did not genuinely feel. What had happened had been accounted for. The people responsible for it had experienced the proportional and precise consequences of what they had done. The ledger was closed. What Mara felt in the weeks that followed was not triumph, because triumph has a peak and a decline and depends on the comparison between what was and what is now, and what she felt was something that required no comparison and would not fade with time. It was the durable and specific satisfaction of having remained entirely herself throughout an experience that had been designed to diminish her, of having walked into a room that had wanted to be her undoing and walked out of it still in full possession of everything that mattered, without having hardened or closed or performed anything she did not feel. The wedding was small and private, and held 3 months later on a coastline she had seen only in photographs for 31 years, in a country warm in November, in a way that felt like a decision the climate had made, rather than a meteorological accident. There were fewer than 30 people present, and every one of them was there for the right reason. She wore white. He wore his real face, the warm and present one. Her mother's ring was on her right hand, the stone shifting green gold in the coastal light. A new ring was on her left hand, bearing the same stone in the same impossible color, worked by hands separated from the first maker by generations and connected to them by everything that matters. They matched each other the way things match when they were always meant to be together, and the only thing that had ever stood between them was time. And here is what this story carries for you. Character is not made by money. It is not conferred by lineage or by address or by the name on the gate at the end of the drive. It is the thing you are in the moments when no one who can offer you anything is watching, when what you do costs you something and you do it anyway, because it is simply who you are. It is what Mara was in that marble foyer, holding food she had made herself, wearing a coat she had ironed, saying good afternoon and meaning it, walking into the luncheon and eating and conversing and sitting in a chair near a window and holding her mother's ring and waiting, because she had always known, in the way she knew things she kept without explaining, that she was not the charity case in that room. She was the only person in that room who was entirely real. You have people in your life who have looked at you and rendered their verdict based on the coat. This story is for you. You are the ring. You are that shifting green-gold light. You do not need to explain it to anyone. You only need to keep it. If this story gave you something today, leave it in the comments below and share it with one person in your life who needs to remember who they are. We will see you in the next one.